Hello and welcome to the U.S. History Underground. I'm Mr. O'Hagan and I'm here with Mr. Zagari
How we doing, everyone?
and a very special guest, Garden City High School senior and music aficionado, Will Morgan.
Hello.
So we're actually here today filming from the soon-to-be new podcasting studio.
It's a little rough right now.
Yeah,
We're
little.
working on it.
Yeah, we were working on it.
It's very underground, though.
Well, it
The
seems
walls.
appropriate, but today on the Underground, rock and roll in the 1960s, how music helped define a new generation. The subject matter of today's podcast is a great crossover to, and specifically inspired by, Mr. Zagari's soundtracks course, which is coming up next year. Can hardly wait. And it's a super follow up to the podcast that Zags and I recorded on 1950s rock and roll. Get onto YouTube and check that one out if you haven't heard it already. I will, once again, defer to my guests for their musical knowledge and act as interviewer to the stars to understand how the music of the 60s defines the era. But first, Zags, why don't we start with a little context?
Sure. So again, Will, thank you for being here.
course.
It's going to be a pleasure. So in that previous podcast that Mr. O was just referencing, we discussed the origins of rock and roll and how the genre reflected the political, social, and economic ethos of the 1950s. Well, today we are going to expand on that idea and look into the 1960s. And remember, the 1960s is really post-Kennedy administration through Nixon. The prosperity of the 50s can't mask the tensions that is rising in this Cold War world. The social conformity of the 50s, in particular, has worn thin with the younger generation. While the music that the younger people are listening to in the early 60s is still reflecting these tensions, the music itself is taking a different direction as it takes on a new look into pop culture and subgenres of rock and roll.
In our 50s podcast, Will, you weren't part of that one,
Yeah.
but Zagari and I used two artists, Elvis and Chuck Berry, and a specific genre, doo-wop, to symbolize the era. So we're going to use that format again and see if we can apply it to the 60s. Will, since you're our guest, we'll give you the opening salvo. Which artist would you start with to represent the 1960s?
100% Bob Dylan. He represents the transition between the beat poets of the 50s and the hippies of the 60s. These two groups had a shared sensibility and rejection of conformity and emphasis on personal freedom, but they were not identicals by any means, right, Mr. Zagari?
I agree with you, Will. Not at all. The Beats were a much more introspective group. In today's vernacular, we would call them almost like emos. In many ways, they were apolitical, whereas the hippies, they were more vocal, and that's where we're going in the 60s. They were far more likely to engage in protests, as we saw with their efforts in the anti-war movement of the late 60s and the 70s. And Dylan really starts then as a beat poet songwriter.
All right, so Zags, how does Dylan compare to, say, Elvis in that regard?
Well, unlike Elvis, Dylan doesn't care about being popular. That's the last thing on his mind. When I'm thinking of this, I think of that early 90s grunge movement of being popular is not cool. It's really being unpopular
Yeah.
is being
The
cool, so to speak.
fringes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Being on the fringe, being in those
Yeah.
You might say the underground.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly. The Velvet Underground.
Oh, there we go. The
I don't
Velvet
think we have
Underground.
time to mention them.
No. This is where we
Man,
could
I
go
am
off.
going to have to rein these two
Yes,
guys
this
in.
this is
Okay.
gonna get But Dylan doesn't care about being popular. His work is reflecting his own political and social beliefs. He doesn't have a Colonel Tom Parker packaging his brand, so to speak. Elvis might have been a 50s rebel, but Dylan is rebelling against the rebel. Elvis is the ilk, so to speak, are sellouts to someone like Dylan.
All right, so with that in mind, Will, I'm going to put you on the spot. Name the song that has the following lyrics. When the king was looking down, the jester stole his
American
thorny crown.
Pie,
Oh, boy, I
Don
didn't even
McLean.
get it out.
This is Will Morgan. You're talking to
Released in
Mr. O'Hagan.
71, and McLean's lyrics reflect the sentiments of the generation where Dylan swooped that spot of the most iconic American performer from Elvis.
Right, so Dylan supplants Elvis, really is the voice of the youth. What is Dylan doing musically, Zags, that sets him apart and really distinguishes him?
Well, Dylan really cuts his teeth on the traditional American folk songbook. That's what he's doing in those early 1960s Greenwich Village clubs. Like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger before him, he takes hymns and traditional folk tunes and rewrites them to reflect social and political and economic issues of the current time period. The difference, though, between what Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie are doing in the 40s and into the early 50s and what Dylan is doing into the early 60s is that Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie are seen as the pariahs of America as a result of the Red Scare. And Dylan is more seen as this hero to some extent because to go down this road, the times they are a changing.
Okay, so we see Seeger and Guthrie as the voices that are being rejected, whereas Dylan's being embraced, particularly by the younger generation. And you kind of walked into my next question: is that the song, "The Times They Are a Changing"? Is that the song that shows us that Dylan had arrived? Maybe you both would like to share some thoughts on that particular
Yeah,
question.
Will, this is your
that song
wheelhouse.
specifically has got to be, the turning point in his public and professional career. It reflects the '60s, became the anthem for many social change movements, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, pretty much everything, feminism, the queer movements that started to occur around this time, and resonated with everyone who were questioning authority, seeking social justice, particularly the young baby boomers who wanted to improve their lives for the better. It also commented on the need to rethink the social conformity, the peace and prosperity narrative that were taught as children of the '50s. And especially because as that was actively collapsing with the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the escalation in Vietnam.
Right.
And by '65, as Vietnam was ramping up, the folk roots get electrified. He tours with the Electric Band, Mike Bloomfield, Robbie Robertson, the rest of the Hawks, who would become the band.
They become the band, and
Yeah.
when we could argue that's when, well, we'll come later to
Yeah.
that, but that's when psychedelia matures and everybody wants to be in the band.
Yeah. He tours with those guys for, Bring It All Back Home, Highway 61, and Blonde on Blonde.
Okay, so we bridge this gap between Elvis and the Beats, and that's Dylan, but we can't talk about the '60s without talking about the Beatles. I mean, they changed everything, right?
I mean, I will defer to Will on the Beatles because he is all things Beatles, and I love the Beatles and everything about them. But I will say we see a shift in the Beatles discography, and Will, I think you would agree with me, in and around
Yes.
Rubber Soul, Revolver, 65,
Yeah.
66. Is that where
Yeah.
we're seeing this shift?
Definitely.
I mean, they're kids from Liverpool
Yeah.
that are coming here for the American Dream.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on it?
On the early works, Please Please Me, I Saw Her Standing There, Hold Me Tight, those songs are really reflecting that idealized American dream that we saw with the Elvis songs, the Chuck Berry songs, even the Little Richard songs. But as
who John Lennon loved.
Yes.
I mean, he was a devotee to
he
Chuck
called
Berry and Little
Elvis,
Richard and Elvis. And
in the Get Back movie, when they say it's Elvis's birthday, he salutes.
right, right.
Guys,
Yeah.
the Beatles don't stay devotees of Chuck Berry and Little Richard, right? The Beatles are saying "I Want to Hold Your Hand" to screaming fans on the Ed Sullivan
Yeah.
Show in '64. They're not the Beatles who put out, the iconic albums like Sgt. Pepper in '67.
Well,
So
after Hard Day's Night, when Beatlemania started to kick in, that's when they do Beatles for Sale and Help. And those albums are very sort of lonely albums. You get I'm a Loser, you get Help, I Need Somebody, Help,
Right.
Anybody Help. So that sort of turns them more inward to what else is there in life. And that's when you get Rubber Soul, In My Life is
that's
on
interesting
that
because
album.
that sounds
Nowhere
more.
Man.
It sounds more like that introspective beat approach, right?
Yes.
In a way.
And they took the influence from Dylan. I mean, on that tour, they were constantly spinning Freewheeling.
And to be quite honest with you, it's that time, and what you're going to see is with this LSD culture that's happening
Dylan
between
introduces them to
64.
marijuana.
Dylan introduces John Lennon and the Beatles to marijuana, and by 64, 65, you also have Bob Dylan, George Harrison, John Lennon, Brian Wilson of the Beach
Yes.
Boys. That's the first time that they take acid.
Yeah.
So now you're seeing a transition out of that Eisenhower-esque 1950s social conformity into this new psychedelic 60s that is going to be the basis of this new counterculture movement. This is where you're going to start to see the Beach Boys with Pet Sound, the Rolling Stones with Aftermath, which is their first album that that's all Jagger and Keith original tunes on it.
Yeah.
Because prior to this, it's
Yeah.
Capitol or Decca or whomever.
After Our Heads had Jagger, Richards,
Exactly.
Brian Jones songs, but it was still filled with like Hitchhike, the Marvin Gaye cover.
Exactly.
I'm
Exactly.
All Right by Bo Diddley.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
so Sgt. Pepper then is clearly the defining moment, the turning point. By
I
the
mean,
way,
just look at the album cover
I
of
was
it.
going to
Yeah.
say, isn't
Yeah.
And Dylan's one of the many faces that appear there.
right?
There you go.
Okay, so then with that in mind, we've clearly got Dylan, we've clearly got the Beatles as our two artists for the 60s. But like our previous podcast on the 50s eggs, we wanted to talk about a genre of music that rounds out our discussion. So, what is that for this particular era? I think you already touched on it, but let's
Right.
get to it.
So I think to round this out, we got to go with the 60s psychedelia, and which in turn takes everything we have discussed in our previous 50s podcast and the subject matter of this episode thus far and kind of melts it together. Psychedelic rock takes on the layers of folk, jazz, Chuck Berry style rock and roll, and now combines that with foreign influenced instruments such as the sitar, for example. That's
Yeah.
when George
You hear
Harrison.
that on Norwegian Wood and Love to You.
Exactly. And then you hear that a lot on Rolling Stone's Aftermath
Paint
as
It
well.
Black.
Paint It Black has the
Yeah.
sitar. So you have that era of Baroque pop, which is bringing in classical Baroque now with this new age rock and roll.
On Ruby Tuesday, you hear that on Eleanor Rigby.
Exactly.
On Caroline No.
Exactly. Anything from the Zombies,
Yes.
Times of the Season,
Yeah.
etc. Exactly. So you're also hearing these now new long drawn out jams, guitar solos made by the Grateful Dead into this new now what is going to be now in our contemporary music, the jam band scene. There's no musical structure.
Yeah.
I'm going to Ken Burns here, which is going to be a la jazz. All right,
Yeah.
where the musical structure, it's more of controlled chaos.
The Byrds on their album Fifth Dimension, they were extremely influenced by Coltrane and what he was doing with
Yes,
Love Supreme.
and then you see jazz music taking a new turn into even becoming psychedelic jazz or acid jazz, which the jazz conformists of the era, they were very dissatisfied with that.
And to get off topic a bit, Ornette Coleman even planted the seeds of that on like The Shape of Jazz to Come.
Right.
But guys,
then
the other part of this though is the inclusion of drugs into this. This kind of sentiment, right? The use of LSD.
The LSD was a huge part of this, but then also, in addition to the use of LSD, which we made mention before of all of these artists taking LSD at the first time, now this new trajectory in rock and roll, which is being influenced by the LSD movement.
What is that trajectory?
So
tell us what this is. Leary type, drop in, drop out.
Right, the Timothy Learys of the drop in, tune in, drop out.
This is Summer of Love. This is San Francisco.
Exactly right. So San Francisco now becomes the epicenter of this new musical and societal scene that's happening.
Family Stone, The Doors, The Dead.
Right, and this is going to be the 1967 Summer of Love. So be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. The Scott McKenzie song. The year begins with what they call the Human Being, which is a very early music festival. It's an art festival in 67 in San Francisco. And this becomes the proving grounds for the counterculture movement. And with the Human Being being the unofficial, basically, kickoff to the counterculture / hippie movement that we all know. The event was the gathering of tens of thousands of people from several diverse racial, ethnic, and educational backgrounds. Exactly. And what they're doing is they're advocating for various causes that are plaguing the time period, with including Vietnam, civil rights, and even environmental causes during this time period.
A Day in the Life of a Tree.
The burning of the you see all these the burning of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland was 68 or 69.
Later on, REM do a song about that.
Right. So they did this through artistic expression, through an atmosphere that was communal and experimental. So, not really good with the hardline anti-communist folks out there.
Right. But so naturally then this kind of social experimentation, that's going to be reflected in the music too, right? I mean, it's the groups that follow this that really kind of become defining of this psychedelic era, correct?
For sure. The two main acts that were part of this upcoming San Francisco psychedelic scene included Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead. And I'm going to have to vamp here a little bit on the Grateful Dead.
Yeah, let's target the Dead.
Absolutely.
They're much more of a cultural phenomenon.
Sure, and especially today with, you see all the steal your face shirts and the psychedelics and the skull, roses, everything. But and they actually played at the Human Being, and they actually played a song called Morning Dew.
They also played the Acid Test with Ken Casey.
Yes, but the song Morning Dew really represents the melting pot that was the psychedelic music. This was more of a contemporary folk song that Jerry Garcia, who was the face of the Grateful Dead, so to speak, put his spin on. Bands in this era would take the root of the song. He added tempo. He added dynamic changes, guitar solos. You're starting to now crank up the fuzz a little bit on an amplifier, so you're getting more feedback and more of a distorted guitar sound, clearly different from that super clean sound of Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly that you saw a decade earlier. So this Canadian folk song is now being amplified into this new San Francisco style psychedelic sound that's reflecting this new counterculture movement of change, with its roots though still in Americana, or in this case a Canadian style. But
Quicksilver Messenger Service did a similar thing with their version
yes,
of Who Do You Love?
and
Their Happy
and they're
Trails
all
album.
and they're all kind of spin-offs of each other. They're
Yeah.
sharing ideas, members.
Nicky Hopkins played with
Yes,
everyone.
Jefferson Airplane, Hot Tuna, for
Yeah.
example. They're
Yeah.
a spin-off of
I mean,
the Dead.
Very interesting musically. We see a much messier kind of musical arrangement in
Yes.
these songs,
Yeah.
which is maybe more reflective of a society that's quote unquote messier, as
Right.
opposed to the neat, clean, manicured lawns.
100%. That's a
right?
great way to.
50-minute songs of Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry.
Right.
Right.
Versus the 7-minute stretch guitar solos of Hendrix and Creedence Clearwater Revival.
As opposed to the 2-minute 53-second like clip
Hound
that
Dog,
has
yes.
to get onto
Yeah.
the radio
Yes.
of the 50s.
And these groups are now dismissing it if you're looking to. You're a sellout if you're looking only to
Right.
put it on the radio.
Right.
So I think that's a very valid point, Mr.
Yeah.
O'Hagan. The era of that Levittown 2.5 kids picket fence is now out.
All right. Well,
All right.
We obviously,
I
as you can
understand
see here, I don't have enough to rein these two guys in, but I think you saw you heard the passion that was being that was shared over this music, and it really does reflect this era of a very messy era in a lot of ways, politically and socially. Well, that's it for us today. We're going to make a solemn promise not to do a part 3 of this podcast strand and talk about disco in the 70s. Though who doesn't love Donna Summer?
I mean, come on.
I do.
Bee Gees' first album was very psychedelic.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we're definitely cutting this off now.
They're like Pink Floyd, where like they started in swinging, London
Yes.
psychedelic stuff.
Be sure to use this YouTube channel for its content spotlights,
Brains
unit
melted by
reviews,
acid.
A Push on the Road segments, and other spectacular podcasts. Special shout out and thank you to
Thank you,
Morgan
Will.
for joining us
Of
today.
course.
Folks, we'll see you next time on the U.S. History Underground.
Take care.
Thank you very
Peace
much.
out.
I really
Bye-bye.
appreciate it. Have a lovely day.
Peace and love.